So we'll have, yeah, those two presentations, and then I will open right up for questions, and we're gonna get started with Francesco. No, his paper is titled "Illiberalism Sans Frontières: A Cross-National Comparison of Ideological Illiberal Components." So, go ahead.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Trieste in Italy. So the paper I'm going to present today is a kind of, I would say it's a spin-off of my PhD research, which was about illiberalism and neo-traditionalism in Poland. Then when I started to also read doing some research in other countries, I realized that what I found in Poland was incredibly similar to what I could see in other countries, in other discourses. So I decided to see if I could widen this research, widen this research, and that's the current paper, which I think I I use here the word comparison. Maybe it's the wrong word because I focused in this paper on the illiberalism as an ideology, but rather than comparing these countries, I've mostly investigated the common themes within different countries, which are except Poland, also Italy, Spain, and Hungary. So maybe I should change this part at the title. So uh, all right. Yeah, so here are the goals of the research, which I would say they are both empirical and theoretical. So on the one hand, yes, I said the goal is to find empirically the shared liberal ideological components in the discourse of four political leaders in these countries, and I've conducted qualitative discourse analysis in this respect. But also, I don't want to provide a new definition of liberalism. I just want to contribute to the conceptual framework of liberalism, seeing it as a reaction to the ontological insecurity caused by progressive. So I don't have my definition of illiberalism, and I adopted the one provided by Marlene as well. Here, that I think everybody's familiar with, and after today's conference, I can save a couple of minutes. I don't need to explain it. And just a couple of things regarding this definition. I wanted to highlight this, I would say, the positive content of liberalism, which we know that is ex negative ideology vis-a-vis liberalism, but it also proposes solutions that are majoritarian national. And it promotes cultural homogeneity and so on. So then I will discuss this equivalence between these. But besides that, I used a hegemonic lens in my analysis. I've been influenced in structural theoretical framework by Gramsci and Antonio Gramsci and Ernesto Laclau. So I see liberalism also as a counter-hegemonic. And as Laclau, I say hegemony, I don't see hegemony just as a positive unfolding of an identity, put it here, but as a response to a crisis. Then later, Laclau saw this crisis, defined this crisis as a lack, something missing to be filled. So in my analysis, my conceptual framework, actually, I was thinking about what is the lack in the illiberal discourse. And here in this, I was inspired by partially Zygmunt Bauman, for the concept of modern liquidity, but also because in one of his work, he said that the displacement of some heteronymous categories and collective categories, like, for example, not like, for example, like religion, the nation, and family, in favor of individual emancipation, caused were a source of, I use a German word as it did, Sicherheit. I don't speak German, but he defined it as lack of security, but not only security like physical security, but also as a lack of certainty, of safety, of direction. So the ontological security of knowing who we are or knowing why we're on this planet, basically. And accordingly, then I thought that he was writing in 1999, so at the peak of the liberal theory. I don't think he would have said that illiberalism would have been an answer to this insecurity. But 25 years later, I would say that is the most successful response to this kind of ontological insecurity. So I see liberalism also as a response to address this lack of security. Not necessary and contingent. I mean, it's not doesn't have to be the only answer to this lack of security, but it's definitely one of the answer to respond to this axiological individualism as Legut put it, to this question to freedom. So liberalism is a kind of answer to this question to freedom. Here a bit of my methodological framework, as I said, is based on discourse theory developed by Laclau. And yeah, one important thing before I want to say that she uses conservative because these kind of actors do not define themselves as illiberal. This is true, but I have a different perspective because the object of my analysis are not these actors that I've analyzed. I just consider them as the voice of illiberalism. So first of all, I've treated in my analysis illiberalism as a discourse, as an ideology, and is expressed by these actors that I have analyzed. And then, just this is what I've done in the analysis, trying to identify these categories, post-structurally discourse theory categories. So crisis, there is, of course, the failure, the lack, as I said before, but also the performance of the crisis and the construction of an enemy. And then the positive construction of the discourse, which is through equivalence and antagonism. And finally, the representation. As I said already a couple of times, this is mostly an ontology of lack. So the construction of a discourse to fill something that is missing. Moving to the case selection is problematic because I've decided to make this choice. I don't know if it's the right one. To select some representative discourse speeches that could give an idea of what illiberalism is. But actually, I had more data than what I've analyzed, that I decided to, just to have a coherent set of data that speak some speeches. So they are first there were 4, then I decided to put more 6 speeches by Santiago Pascal, Giorgia Meloni. So Santiago Pascal from Spain, Giorgia Meloni from Italy, Viktor Orban from Hungary, and Jarosław Kaczynski from Poland. So the analysis was qualitative analysis. And moving to the empirical part, the first step, as I said, it was to identify this lack, find this lack of security, certainty, predictability, as I said, even though sometimes it's not something that you can actually see, but then you see that when they construct this crisis, they always point to this kind of piece missing in our society. So here it is clear, I think, from this fragment by Giorgia Meloni, this conflict between fluid identities, so this, I would say, progressive construction of identity, which is something that can change, that can be individually decided, and essentialist identity. So she says, for example, that the fundamental ground of our conflict in our time is identity, which is considered an enemy. She adds that everything that defines us is under attack. So everything that tells us who we actually are is under attack. And so the answer would be to be found in pre-established categories, collective categories, rather than relative categories. Similarly, also Pascal talked about the eternal values that never change, that define us. Of course, there is no such a thing as eternal values. There is no eternal humanity, so you cannot say that. But the point is that these eternal values are a source of security, because thanks to them, then people they know who they are. So as I say, the liberalism provides this kind of security. I mean, the liberal discourse, the liberal ideology. And then later, crises are also performed in practical terms, as here we did, using a very similar vocabulary, saying that also values are under attack. There is an attack on values, on the church, on the national traditions. So here again, I found that this fragment very significant because it kind of reminded me what Bauman said when he said that insecurity comes from the displacement of religion, nation, and family. And actually, it's also saying there is an attack on nation, on values, which is connected to the family because the family is seen as a place where values are handed down. On the church, which is also connected to the cultural identity, and so on. So they are performed exactly this crisis, saying that they have exactly saying, but in this case, illiberalism would be the answer. And just yeah, just a small thing regarding the construction of the enemy. That's more a stick difference. Giorgia Meloni doesn't attack liberalism as such. For example, she says globalism is mainstream. The same is for Pascal. Here, she also uses the targets of the passionaries of progressivism. She was in Madrid at the Vox rally, so she was using what Pascal would say. While, for example, Orban and Kaczynski sometimes directly blame liberalism. Just because in Italian that's not like easy to say that, or Spanish as well, you cannot just be against liberalism because there is the same root of libertà, of freedom. So there is this difference, but I think it's more formal than substantial. And on a side note, another difference I found is that Kaczynski and Orban use a anti-colonial narrative sometimes, something that is not done by Meloni and Pascal, just for historic reason. And yeah, but that's another actually another part of my research that I didn't entirely here. And yeah, these are a few examples of how the lack of security is performed as crisis. So there is an attack on nation. This is the lack they perform, which is then transformed into a crisis of, for example, cultural globalizations. Then signifier religion is displaced. There is an attack on religion, and which is then transformed into a crisis of Islamization. It could be, for example, migrant crisis, and so on. Attack on family translated into a crisis of relativism and nihilism. So this is the bridge between what is missing and how then they try to mobilize people by performing crisis. This is just a typical narrative crisis of narrative of crisis. And then the positive construction of illiberalism, linking these nodal points, these main categories, nation, family, and tradition, which that's why at the beginning of the presentation I added that sentence of the definition of illiberalism, because we can see that they are treated as equivalent and they are treated as part of the same narrative. And this speech here is quite famous in Italy. I don't know if any of you is familiar with that because it was transformed into a song which became very popular. I believe is one of the reasons why, not one of the reasons why Meloni won the election, but how she became very, very popular. And yeah, she's constructing, of course, as usual, there is this enemy that attacked the family and the nation and so on. But then at the end, she concludes this part of the speech claiming, saying, I'm Georgia, I'm a woman, I'm a mother, I'm Italian, and I'm Christian. So linking all these identities, pre-established identities, of course, because then they're not like left identities, they are like already existing identities connected. Gender roles, I'm a woman, traditional social roles, like a mother, national identity, cultural identity, Christian, treated as part of the same narrative. So this is what I believe is part of illiberalism, because it's an answer to the, as I said at the beginning, axiological individual. So a response to the possibility of choosing one's identity, while illiberalism provides already existing identity. And they're constructed as equivalent. And of course, there is also a opposite chain of equivalence, individualism, relativism, and so on. Yeah, I don't have much time, so I'll skip that. But this is also this equivalence is also reflected in how to redefine freedom. It's very interesting, but yeah, it will take too much time. And jumping to the conclusion. So as I said, I had two main goals: empirical and theoretical. So from an empirical point of view, I think the analysis shows that illiberalism can be seen as a counter-hegemonic project, cross-national in some terms, yes, and which is trying to emphasize in these collective identities which are constructed as equivalent, based on these nodal points that I've already mentioned. But in terms of conceptual contribution, I think one of the potential criticism to the concept of illiberalism could be that as it proposes solutions that are so majoritarian, nationalist, and so on, that someone that it could be say that there is no need to use the concept of liberalism because we could just say that it's populist, it's just nationalism, it's just nativism, it's just traditionalism, and so on. But what is very important is to understand this equivalence between these main nodal points constructed on the same lac. In that sense, we can talk of I use in the paper I use the an umbrella as an umbrella concept. I don't know if this is the case, but yeah, in some sort of sense, we can say that it's a kind of umbrella concept of some illiberal response to individualism and to this postmodern lack of security. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Francesco. On time, we're moving on to our second paper by Daniel, titled Back to the Trenches: Russia's Invasion of Ukraine and the Militant Far Right.
Sorry for already tweaking the title, but this paper is very much metastasizing beyond some of my original concepts. So I'm a PhD candidate here at George Washington University. This grew out of one of my subcases. I look at far-right actors engaged in low-intensity organized violence and public coercion, and the Ukrainian far-right group's participation, as a minority, but as a quite active minority in the Euromaidan protests and the Ukrainian political landscape afterwards, as well as their paramilitary activity, is what sparked my interest. And obviously, with Russia's invasion of Ukraine in 2022, their activities developed in some quite interesting ways that I think a lot of the current discourse about the Ukrainian far right in a transnational context does not reflect. So just to give a brief summary of kind of what I want to talk about here is I want to look at some of the old analytical frames that have been used to situate the Ukrainian far right, both ones to try to allay concerns about the Ukrainian far right as a minority actor, as well as ones that have sensationalized its concern as a potential transnational haven for extremist violence. I want to talk about how the Ukrainian far right has actually mobilized in a military context since the beginning of the war in a way that I think has quite substantively changed the organizational behavior of these groups relative to a lot of our kind of understanding established between Maidan and during the lower intensity phase of the separatist conflict in Donbass. Breaking that out into two dimensions, we'll talk about both the approaches to the political mainstream and outreach within the far right milieu, and we'll conclude with some considerations of the future with an eye to some of the themes that we've kind of talked here at the end of the day. So first, one way that we can think about the Ukrainian far right is that it's very much an outlier in terms of a lot of the organizations, parties, and movements we've talked about today. Ukraine's electoral far right had only one real substantive breakthrough in 2012 that was very quickly reversed, and that was by the Svoboda Party, which had attempted to shed kind of the paramilitary image of its predecessors, the Social Nationalist Party of Ukraine. Pictured here, we have a meeting with representative of the French National Front at the Party Congress of in 2000. You can think about the quite divergent paths that these organizations have been on, where while you had some effort to moderate on the part of Svoboda, you also had a continuation of that social nationalist trend that was particularly active in the establishment of Ukraine's far-right paramilitaries, whereas the National Front has not only gone on to become a quite electorally successful vehicle, but has largely tried to shed its associations with paramilitarism, not entirely successfully, But certainly it's quite a striking contrast, and obviously their national interests are not aligned, where the French National Front and later National Rally have been associated with kind of pro-Russian tendencies, like many of the far-right parties. I think that's, a somewhat outdated framework in light of the strategic electoral shifts that far-right parties have made since the invasion. But nevertheless, the Liberal International, often, especially the institutionalized Liberal International, takes a rather ambiguous stance on Ukraine. And to the extent that it supports Ukraine, it supports it in terms of its national sovereignty, its status as a European country under assault from hostile forces, rather than any real interest in engaging with Ukraine's far right, which remains quite isolated in those channels. We can also think about Ukraine's far right as an outlier in terms of its militancy. There is no other country in the world where you have comparable integration of far right organizations into military structures. We can talk about how there is a far right presence in many Western militaries, but even in rare cases where they manage to sort of capture the organizational culture of a unit, I'm thinking about the German KSK. This is very quickly dealt with by authorities, and there are very substantive efforts to break up this kind of activity. We haven't seen the same effort to systematically displace far-right organizational structures in the context of the volunteer units. As a result of heightened Western interest in far-right violence, thinking about the assassination of Joe Cox, thinking about Charlottesville, the Christchurch massacre, there was a huge wave of Western interest in the Ukrainian far-right that tended to emphasize its ties with the most violent and extreme transnational actors, organizations like Atomwaffen and other neo-Nazi accelerationists that, as a matter of fact, have done very little actual violence outside their own milieu, but because of the provocative nature of their ideology, received quite a lot of attention, understandably so. There's a lot of speculation, including from members of Congress, from major thinkers in the counterterrorist space, that Ukraine could become some kind of hub, a white nationalist Afghanistan is sometimes the term used, that could destabilize the Western world. Obviously, a severe exaggeration of what the actual situation is. All of these issues have only been exacerbated by Putin's inclusion of denazification, a term whose real meaning is ambiguous to almost everybody, and certainly applies to a much wider swath of Ukrainian nationalism than just the far right units. But the result, of course, is there's only more propaganda, misleading coverage, unreliable coverage, and politically motivated defenses and attacks of these units, which has made a large part of this paper just a basic, simple, descriptive, empirical effort to try to understand what's going on with these units in their own terms. So to very briefly summarize an incredibly complicated process, the main phenomena we should think about in terms of far-right military mobilization is the return of a lot of activist veterans and new generations of Ukrainian far-right activists to the front line. The size of far-right volunteer units before the full-scale invasion was quite limited. We're talking about only a regiment-sized structure for Azov and sometimes smaller structures for many of these other groups. That limits the number of people who can actually participate in the front line. It makes it a reward and a privilege rather than the default state. Nevertheless, a lot of these organizations use their peacetime activities to establish paramilitary training, to use youth educational outreach, other structures to help kind of engage in that process of the far right activists as subject formation, but also to provide a real mobilizational capability for what they believed as an inevitable escalation of the war, an expectation in which they were quite vindicated. Because of their preparation relative to other newly formed Ukrainian units, they had a significant advantage. If you are recruited to one of these units and you pass their selection processes that they run independently, which again is another quite unusual departure from many other militaries, one that Ukraine has had to implement because of circumstances and the difficulties of reforming a Soviet legacy military bureaucracy. You could join one of these units and feel more confident that you would survive the war, that you would serve alongside seasoned leaders who had to train themselves to the best of NATO standards because they were excluded from it, at least formally, not always completely. And this, obviously provides a lot of opportunities for these units. People who were previously, some who were literally sitting in jail for their activities as part of far-right parties opposing Zelensky's government were allowed to return and led quite successful military units. But there's also severe constraints. Trying to run a unit where you're not just responsible for forming new units, training volunteers, preparing your own logistical mobilization is very demanding, and it leaves very little space for formal political activity. Alongside that, the sort of mood of national unity early in the war strongly advised against oppositional activity that would be perceived as some way undermining the Ukrainian cause. So you see the political leadership return entirely to military units. In some cases, you have these smaller groupuscules that I'll talk about later, joining wholesale as new units. So under these conditions, what should we expect transnational outreach to look like? Centering this military activity as the primary goal of Ukrainian far-right groups. So to summarize very briefly here, it's a Janus-faced approach. They are locked out of the Illiberal International. They don't have much of a benefit to going after support from a lot of these institutionalized major far-right parties because they're trying to shed their image. And a lot of these parties are, either pro-Russian or still have their reservations about Ukraine and are not particularly eager to meet them. As a result, you have an outreach to the liberal mainstream in a lot of respects. Why? One, because it helps accomplish some of their ideological goals of destigmatizing the units. It helps reach, very real policy decisions that are made by people from within the political mainstream. And it helps also tap into the broader crowd-funded network of logistical aid that's come from the Western world that is not always discriminating about what units it will and won't get involved with. By contrast, the approach to the far right is carried out by a very different set of structures, not the formal military units themselves for the most part, but by the subcultural and kind of groupuscular networks that are often incorporated within the units as individual companies, platoons, squads, or scattered across units. These are organizations that can speak a little bit more freely without concern of crossing streams with the liberal political outreach. And their goal is not to convince the rest of the world that these units are not far right, but that Russia should have no moral and political authority among the European far right, that Russia is an enemy of nationalism tradition by invading another European country. And it's to try to build on some pre-existing ties with these other sort of revolutionary nationalist and groupuscular subcultural networks to push their agenda. So there's a huge amount of examples here that I won't go into, but please ask me after the break if you're curious. You'll note that when Azov's National Guard sent representatives to advocate for the release of the prisoners from the Azovstal siege, who were almost certainly experiencing grave human rights violations at the hands of Russian authorities, they're not reaching out to neo-Nazis or people in skull masks. This is Francis, Fukuyama and Bernard Henri Lévy. Like this is liberals par excellence who are meeting with Azov. And liberalism has its own associations with wartime mobilization and nationalism that are compatible here. And I'm certainly not suggesting that either of these figures have suddenly become supporters of National Corps, but it shows you that Azov is aware of sort of where the moral and material support from the Western world really lies if it wants to survive as a unit. One unusual outlier that received a lot of discussion is Victoria Spartz, who's a very MAGA-oriented congresswoman from Indiana, but she's also born in Ukraine. She traveled to Ukraine personally and met with the Azov-founded 3rd Assault Brigade, and then almost immediately upon return caused a minor diplomatic crisis by trying to get Zelensky's advisor, Andriy Yermak, fired, which was a longtime goal of Ukrainian far-right nationalists. So again, there are some cases there, but it's quite an idiosyncratic one. By contrast with the far right, you see discussion of the Soviet Union. Russia is a sort of a neo-Soviet or neo-Bolshevik entity that is, when you look at Putin's appeals to the Russian population, he talks about Russia as a multinational country that appeals to a broader sense of Russian identity in the Russian world. This is one that those from the sort of social nationalist origins of the Ukrainian far right vehemently reject and are able to kind of call upon the memory politics of World War II, many of the same discourses, including imitations of propaganda from the Russian Liberation Army and things like that. There's a pre-existing project on part of these organizations to try to make Ukraine an alternative between Atlanticist liberalism and Eurasian authoritarianism. But in a lot of cases where this outreach is actually happening is in these sort of more obscure far-right activist milieus, the National Socialist black metal rock against communism scenes, football ultras, the world of sort of paramilitary mercenary adventurers. We're not talking about a large group of people who can sustain the immense material needs of a full-scale industrial war. But we should talk about the expatriate units, those largely from post-Soviet space, who've decided to settle in Ukraine as a result of repression, taking advantage of the fact that Ukraine is a liberal democracy where foreign opposition activists do have the freedom, but also can sort of maintain connections with their home countries. Out of these, and with now the over previously speculated sponsorship of the Ukrainian military intelligence, the HUR, you have units like the Russian Volunteer Corps, founded by a very infamous white nationalist and national socialist set of activists, Russian dissidents, who believe that Putin has betrayed the nationalist movements, and then a smaller representative of that tendency among the Belarusian opposition and BDK. So the future considerations here, sort of in light of some of the themes we've talked about. Despite the fact that Ukraine shares most of the illiberal worldview, that most of their remarks on family, tradition, perhaps not the church given the prevalence of pagans, but they're at least willing to accommodate it. They share much of the worldview, but that's not who they're reaching out to internationally, especially at the most high levels of contact. Illiberal liberal cooperation against other illiberal wars is not a new phenomenon, and this is hardly unprecedented. But it doesn't necessarily lead to ideologically thick connections. And when there is ideological change, it's not always the illiberal actor that is liberalizing. So it's worth watching what groups prove receptive to this sort of outreach and how they will react to potential future developments in Ukraine. I doubt Sparts will be the last person to criticize decision-making by the Zelensky administration, for example, at that kind of level. To the extent that Ukraine is a hub of militancy, we've looked almost entirely in the wrong direction. There's really not much of a strategic reasoning in the worldview of the Ukrainian far right to try to export violence west. They want resources from the west so they can export violence east. Whether or not the Russian Volunteer Corps will be successful either in its direct operations in Russia or in providing a sort of new pole of illiberal learning for disillusioned Russian oppositionists who are increasingly shut out of non-nationalist avenues of discourse remains to be seen. But given the role of these sorts of volunteer formations historically and becoming the germs of new far-right tendencies, I think it's worth some strong consideration. And finally, to kind of talk about metapolitics, liberal learning literature, the battlefield is one of the original sites of far-right metapolitics. When we talk about younger, like Storm of Steel is in the backpacks of a lot of Ukrainian soldiers. It's the name of Azov's traveling exhibition in the Baltics, where they put their soldiers alongside photos of the Galician division in the Ukrainian insurgent army. These units are reviving the classic sort of interwar archetype of the stormtrooper, and I don't use that in a provocative way. That's the literal translation of Sturmovik, the assault unit as it's usually translated in English, the 3rd Assault Brigade. You can see the Arditi sort of banner and skull in use by Revanche, which is a sort of Orthodox Christian far-right group. They are acquiring military legitimacy, and perhaps their advice is only limited to military matters, but a country experiencing total war sees a lot of its political decision making all within the military realm. And so we need to be cognizant that this is a quite dramatic difference, both from the primary liberal transnational, but also from the sort of more nefarious and largely sensationalized liberal transnational of accelerationism and neo-Nazism. We need to bring the battlefield back into the consideration, which is something that far-right studies hasn't had to do in this way for quite some time. All right, thanks very much.
All right. Well, thank you both for these really fascinating presentations. I'm gonna open the floor straight away for questions. I do have one, but I won't abuse my role. Maybe we'll start there.
Hello, I'm an undergrad student, sophomore, studying international relations. And I would like to ask if this group you mentioned in Ukraine, after the war, do you think they're going to be still politically active and stronger? in terms of like control over the military or other ministries?
Hi, thank you very much for both presentations. And I have a question to Francesco regarding critique of liberalism. So I know the motive of this conference is liberalism in a cultural sense. However, I would like to ask you if in analyzing Orban and Kaczynski, have you stumbled upon them also referring negatively to liberalism in the economic sense? And I'm asking this question because the state as offered by Law and Justice or the policies, it's a very etatist program, right? And they also not only addressed a strong anti-communism and, you know, this vulgar version of liberalism, I believe you were quoting, but also talking, they were especially Kaczynski was talking also about the losers of transformation and how much turbo-liberalism, turbo-capitalism harms people, traditional values, but also you know, social security, basically. So do these two motives, narratives come together, and is it mostly criticism of cultural liberalism and then, however, embracing economic liberalism? Thank you.
Take your two more.
Yeah, thank you very much. Also a question to Francesco. I'm also studying some of the leaders that you're working on. And I wanted to ask you, because you said that the question of using the term liberalism is more formal. And in that sense, I, for example, interpret that question of for the formal use of liberalism more in a sense of abusing the term liberalism and returning it from a constitutional point of view. For example, Ferris wrote a book, Female Nationalism, that inspired me to use this abuse of terms in a way that paves the way to like for legalistic autocrats, right? Like this abuse of terms and concepts by liberal actors, which then gives them the power as well to abuse them in a constitutional rule of law setting. So that was a little bit my question, how you deal with these things. Thank you.
Thank you. Question for both of you. Really great presentation. Francesco, the 4 countries you selected are 4 countries where the illiberal leader are clearly conservative in terms of values. And I was wondering how you would deal, not telling you to change your choice of countries, but how you would do with countries where the liberal leader had to become more progressive in terms of some social issues, like France with Marine Le Pen, or Netherlands, right, where so Marine Le Pen, she's favorable to abortion, she's okay with gay marriage, so they cannot play the ultra conservative classic thing. So I was wondering in that case, because I think you have a great point about it's the postmodern liquidity of identity that is the core issue for them. But in that case, what would be, do you think, the element that they would have to show some form of conservatism when it's not the kind of sexual gender one, which is probably the most obvious? Because I was thinking everything related to memory, it's where you see, I think, the conservatism emerging. Like, for example, and I was mentioning that at the beginning of the conference, in France, if you are Marine Le Pen and you are saying, I'm in favor of abortion and in favor of gay marriage, and how do you explain that you are conservative? And the way you say that is that I don't think we should rewrite the history of colonization and always say it was bad, because colonization bring broad. So see, they have to find other niche to show some form of conservatism, because the sexual moral one is, they lost it in a sense, they cannot play on that. So just a question of discussion. And Daniel, a great presentation on a super sensitive topic. So I'm really happy you're doing that, and just seeing Fukuyama and Bernard-Henri Lévy with Azov member, just, yeah. No comment. Yeah, I was wondering how much because I think one of the key elements you have, which is a place for mainstreamization, is everything around this intermarium geopolitical project, which is really Eurasianisms in the reverse version. I was wondering how much also the fact that now there is so much pressure on Ukrainian men to join the army, and it's super stressful because they know they won't get trained. So it seems there is just an explosion in Ukraine about private military training, because you know you will be sent to the front, so you are ready to pay to get trained. So at least you hope to survive as long as possible. So it has opened a big business of private military, training. I was wondering if it was not a niche where you could see the far right kind of moving, because both you make money and both you recruit a pool of potential, sympathizer, because I think it's all about looking about this kind of subcultural niches where you can move from radical far right to kind of mainstreamization, mixed martial art, right, video game. And I think in the war context in Ukraine, this kind of military training, kind of, warfare, urban warfare preparation type of thing. I don't know if you saw that, but just would be interested in having your feedback on that.
Okay, so maybe we can answer these and then we'll open. Yeah.
So, okay, thanks for your question. I'll start from first one about liberalism in the economic sense. I would answer about Poland mostly because I've studied mainly Poland, and I was not interested in economic liberalism. So when I analyzed Orban, I didn't code this part, so I honestly don't remember. But in Poland, and I have analyzed many Kaczynski speeches, he uses this. He criticizes liberalism in terms of economy, saying that they, for example, destroy Polish solidarity. They created this individualistic, in economic sense, society, and he wants to restore this thing. But this is because PiS is also a social conservative party, is different than other party. And I want to link that also to the question of Marlene, because it's sometimes, you can, I don't think that political actors, or in general actors, are coherent monolithic actors. They can have different ideas. And for example, in this case, Kaczynski is one of the few leaders, in my opinion. Sometimes Meloni uses this rhetoric, but she doesn't really apply in practice. But he's one of the few leaders that, illiberal leaders, that has a illiberal worldview in almost everything, also economy. But I don't think this is the case for many other leaders. And linking this to the other question, and I didn't stress enough this point in the presentation. I kind of forgot, I was too hot. My analysis is on discourse, and the object of analysis is illiberalism as a discourse. When there is this kind of detour from illiberalism, I don't need to consider them as illiberal. There are like parts of or I can say there is some parts of their policies, their speeches, their discourses that are not illiberal. So in this case, for example, if Le Pen, an illiberal, mainly liberal leader proposes a liberal policy, it doesn't mean that that policy, that point of view must be considered as illiberal. And the other way around, there are many liberals that have some illiberal, propose some illiberal policies. So I don't take political actors as monolithic actors, first of all. And second, as I said, I mean, one of the key point of my research in general, not just this research, is that I always place discourse before the actors. So this is my ontological point of view, which can give you an answer. This is, I'm not saying I'm right, but this is how I conduct the analysis. So in that case, I'm saying this is illiberalism. Something that is not connected to this point cannot be considered as illiberal. And that is true for any other ideology or worldview, as we want to call it. And finally, the use of the word liberalism. Mine was just an hypothesis that, actually not just a bit more than an hypothesis, because I also conducted research in Italy, conducting interviews with members of Fratelli Italia, Meloni's party. And when I asked them what they think about illiberal democracy according to Orban, they say, no, of course we cannot agree because we are liberal, because we are for freedom, because this is, a language thing. While in Polish and Hungarian, it's not so straightforward. If they abuse to this word liberals to attack the liberal regime. I don't know. Hard to say. I don't think so because Orban in his speech, for example, say, I know illiberalism sounds negative. Yesterday we were also discussing that maybe we should use Christian democracy, not illiberal democracy. So sometimes maybe, he can also play with words. So sometimes he can use it to attack liberal democracy. So the liberal regime, sometimes he can say, no, I think yesterday was your presentation, if I'm not mistaken. You can use like Christian democracy to highlight some parts, sometimes liberal democracy to attack the regime. So they can play with words. I don't have a clear answer here because I don't know what they have in mind. But yeah, my hypothesis was just about the linguistic use of liberalism as an enemy. And I think it's all.
So first to your question about the post-war role of the Ukrainian far right, we'd have to ask what post-war. It's quite early to see what that will look like. I think regardless of the situation, the mass of people who have participated, the advances in their political fortunes, and I think probably more importantly, the diversification of the sponsors of far-right units outside of the relatively narrower bases we saw under Poroshenko and Zelensky. For a long time, Azov, for example, was almost entirely dependent on the interior minister, Arsen Avakov. There's a lot of speculation after his dismissal in 2021 that this was going to severely degrade Azov's political fortunes. Luckily for them, with the creation of units in the regular military, and as well as the participation of some of their units within military intelligence structures, they now at least have some other institutional sponsors. Their place, of course, is not secure. Budanov, the head of military intelligence, is considered currently to be at risk for dismissal. This would be quite an unpopular decision among much of the Ukrainian right, not just the far right nationalists. But I think they will have the infrastructure to continue activity in some form. To what extent having to absorb a large number of people from outside the far right milieu is going to change that is open to debate. I don't think we should automatically assume this will necessarily moderate their position in that they're going through a hierarchical organization that trains and includes ideological education in some form as part of the recruitment process. But we're likely to see at least some core grouping of activists who will reemerge from the war with significant new credibility. How many of them will want to go back into politics as opposed to explore institutional routes is an interesting question. But it's too early to say, but I would be surprised if this war would be the end of it and they just sort of disappear into the ether afterwards. To your point on paramilitary training, I definitely agree. That's another milieu I didn't really talk about as much, but it is one, especially when you're trying to acquire commercially available military gear, which is a large part of fundraising. You saw like Tim Kennedy, who's like a former Green Beret and MMA fighter. He also went with Sparts to Ukraine and he met with members of 3rd Assault Brigade. A lot of his fans did not like that and are in the comments talking about why are you hanging out with these Ukrainian Nazis? Not because they're leftists, but because they're Trump supporters. And so it's unclear to what extent they'll be able to break through. But I think one area that will be interesting and is a little harder to look at transnationally, at least at the moment, is like these units are now the only units in the world that have engaged in some of the forms of conventional warfare against a major power adversary. That is valuable experience that NATO and other countries are going to be very interested in. In February of this year, 3rd Assault Brigade helped secure the withdrawal of the 110th Brigade, while under Russian assault. There's no Western military unit that's done something that complex in decades. And so there's going to be significant demand, I think, not just from these kind of private networks, which is definitely, as in the old like Rhodesian mercenary networks and soldier of fortune types in Central America, you'll definitely see some of that. But I think there's also going to be potential, more state-sponsored vectors for some of these guys to, build out their Western contacts. And, again, it's not something that Western countries like to highlight or promote for its own sake. I'm thinking of when 3rd Assault Brigade soldiers went for training in France. It was really only unveiled when some of their tattoos got exposed by a French researcher. But at a certain point, like these guys have military experience that militaries will want, just like veterans of our adversaries after World War II. The US military is very interested in talking to them. You see this process repeat time after time, and I don't think, I don't think their ideological affiliations prevent them from marketing that experience in some way.
Okay, so we have time for a few more questions, maybe. Okay, so we'll go first in the back and then two here.
Um, talked a little bit about Maloney and kind of how they ideologically frame things. What I'm curious about is the commonality between Orban, Maloney, the Polish like Law and Justice and whatnot, and now increasingly in the U.S. with like Vance, is they all kind of have this sort of like ties to like a certain part of like the Catholic Church. I'm kind of curious to what extent that certain elements of like the Catholic Church are acting as like a vector for certain like framings and ideological ideas, and why you think that is particularly.
This is a question for Daniel. In your talk, you used the term social nationalists to describe a group in Ukraine. Are turns of phrase such as this part of their international outreach, or is there like a more real ideological distinction between the more commonly known National Socialism?
Julian Waller, George Washington. So a question for Francesco. I really enjoyed the this understanding of illiberalism in terms of this ontological identity and security, which fits well with the reaction component. And it made me think about whether that applies to the major question of, is it possible to have an illiberal leftism or a left illiberalism? Thinking in terms of class identity, right, as opposed to just national identity or the identity of the family, whether or not insecurity over working class people in Europe and elsewhere contributes to them, say, voting for Sarah Wagenknecht in Germany, the AfD or whatever, sort of an illiberalization due to the insecurity of your class status or your status in a materialist sense? Or do you think that that's a conceptual bridge too far? I don't actually have a position on this, I'm just interested. And to Dan, both also fabulous. I wanted to hear you talk a little bit more. You started pulling this thread in terms of where these sort of far right military guys are getting traction within the Ukrainian armed forces, institutionally and organizationally. You mentioned Hur, right, with Kirill Budanov. He loves Junger, Storm of Steel, and all of that. But I'm wondering, given the degree of officer churn in the Ukrainian military due to casualties, attrition, so on and so forth, whether or not there are particular avenues for highly performing commanders among these volunteer militias getting into higher level positions in the Ukrainian general staff or other organizational echelons within the military, if you're not seeing that and they're sort of constrained to these volunteer organizations, relatively speaking.
Okay. So regarding the Catholic Church, so that's one of the cases where it's actually very much context dependent. I've said, for example, that also Meloni stresses the importance of Christianity, but she has, and in general, Italian right-wing politician, an understanding of Christianity much more connected to cultural Christianity, not much to the Catholic Church. This is because of historical reason, because they're not Catholic, basically, they're all divorced, so they cannot really say that. And she's a mother, but she's a single mother, never married, so it's a bit different. In practice, I don't think there are, there were links with the Vatican. The Vatican is very powerful in Italy, but I honestly don't know which are the links now with politics. While in Poland is a completely different thing, and only in Poland, I think, in Europe, where the Catholic Church is defined by Kaczynski as part of the Polish identity. He says in a sentence, our identity is connected to the Catholic Church. Outside the Church, there is only nihilism. So it's connecting this lack of values with, on the other side, the presence of the Church as the defender of traditional Polish values. So, but that's context dependent because Poland has a different history. So you can say that, maybe believes that. Yeah, so, and again, in this case, maybe I know here that the links with the Catholic Church are much stronger with Kaczynski with peace than in Italy for sure. Then regarding your question about the left illiberalism, I can only speculate because I didn't do any research about that. In my articles, sometimes in my thesis, I always hint at the fact that this economic insecurity, like the precariat, could have been the root of some left-wing illiberalism. But then I really don't know. You made a good point about the class as a collective identity that maybe existed, that doesn't exist anymore so strong. And I think, referring again to Bauman, while he was saying that the nation, the religion and family has been disrupted, so there is this kind of insecurity. It's much easier for right-wing liberals to construct an answer to this insecurity just because these categories actually always exist. Not always, but yeah, they existed in the past. For example, Bauman proposes something which I didn't really understand, but it didn't have success, of course, to cope with this insecurity. And I think it's much more complicated for the left to create something new. I mean, I would like to have an answer, honestly. I mean, personally, like to know how to feel more comfortable in this world, to give sense to my life. But yeah, I think it's much more complicated because it's something that needs to be created from scratch, while religion has been there for millennia and the nation has been there for centuries. So that's why they can just pick pre-established categories and use them.
So first to the question about social nationalism, I would say no, that the original formulation of that term, in some ways, at least based on what's been made available by some of these groups, is that social nationalism was a preferable term because they wanted to emphasize it was nationalism with a social orientation towards the economy rather than a nationalist form of socialism. So it's more because of the stigmatism surrounding socialism as a term in a decommunizing country. To the extent that it was kind of a tactical adaptation. But that formulation is almost entirely dropped from post-Maidan conceptualizations of these groups. In a lot of ways, Azov represents a more diverse section of the Ukrainian far right than its predecessor groups did. So yes, those original organizations are still there and still part of it. But you have people who are maybe more representative of traditionalist orientations. You had cooperation with like Orthodox Christian groups who did not always enjoy the very pagan orientation of many of the founders of Azov. You have people who are more from the kind of national conservative perspective. I didn't talk very much about groups that are primarily national conservative in orientation, just because they are less connected to transnational networks outside of, say, like the Ukrainian diaspora. But in general, Azov is a more ecumenical slice of the Ukrainian far right than it was before, which is part of why they've been sort of successful as a political vehicle, is overcoming some of that sectarianism. To the question about officer advancement and kind of outreach within the regular Ukrainian ranks, it's a very interesting one. Alexei Kuzmenko did a paper for Illiberalism Studies Program about an Azov-related effort to work within existing military academies. To my knowledge, that it hasn't produced a particularly high-profile officer during the war yet, but again, at the level they were being trained, I'm not sure they've had the opportunity yet. The invective against the sclerotic Soviet-era bureaucracy is very much part of the mobilizational appeal of these volunteer units, so I don't know if they would want necessarily to advance through those channels, although some presumably do. But there are drawbacks, there are costs. I would say that one area where Azov, I can certainly confirm it's been very active, is in trying to get officers it does not like, that it does not consider reliable, removed from the rotation. So like Bodan Kordovich, who's like the chief of staff for the Azov National Guard Regiment, now the National Guard Brigade, during the siege of Azovstal, called for Budanov to replace Zaluzny as the chief of the general staff. They since have softened on Zaluzny a bit and tried to stay, for the most part, out. They're not the most active nationalist voices in the debate about staff command, but Kardovich also almost single-handedly started the investigation into the commander responsible for Ukraine's southern front at the beginning of the war, to get him removed because of his perceived responsibility in possible corruption or collaboration that may have been involved in the very rapid collapse of Ukraine's south and the encirclement of Mariupol. So I think for the most part, they seem to be taking a negative stance. I am not well read enough into the conventional Ukrainian military internal debates, as much as I try to keep up with them, to know if they have particular champions. But Beletsky's command, when he sort of really formally unveiled himself as the commander of 3rd Assault Brigade in Bakhmut, was in command of a tactical group that included non-Azov units. They've certainly built out more ties and generated a lot more positive feeling among Ukrainian military service. So it seems like a possibility, but the political incentives for both the general staff and for the volunteer units are complicated. But it's definitely something I'm interested in.
All right. Well, thank you both. Please join me in thanking our panelists. And we've come to an end. So, Marlene.
Yeah, I wanted to thank everybody for staying with us these 2 days, even in a very hot room and with such a nice weather outside. A big thanks to all of you who have been traveling from very far away. We hope it was interesting. There will be follow-up publication and so on in November for those of you who are in DC. We will have 1.5 days on US Christian nationalism just after the election. So that promised to be hot topic. And so in any case, we hope it was a good occasion for all of you to meet and learn who else is working on similar topics, and that it will create kind of long-lasting academic and links. And please join me in thanking all my wonderful Illiberalism Study Program team. You have all of them here: John, Grant, Aaron, Eric, everybody. All the IRIS team is here. Thank you all so much, and wishing you all the best, and be in touch soon.